Hello guys, what's up? FYI, I'm on partial shadow ban. Can be hard to find my videos. Can never find the first three. So if you want to find them, go to Vincent Bruno shadowban.blogspot.com and you can find all of my videos there, which you are not able to find on YouTube. The title of this is Christian Science and Judeo-Freemasonry, though you're not going to see much on Christian Science and Judeo-Freemasonry today. Excuse me. If you want to see the connections between Christian Science and Judeo-Freemasonry, go to bewisestserpents.blogspot.com. It's at the bottom of the screen and it's in the description box. So is Vincent Bruno shadowban.blogspot.com. But you will find at bewisestserpents.blogspot.com that information. I am looking for ex-Christian scientists who are interested in exposing Christian Science for being an evil, messed up religion that kills children, for being connected to Freemasonry, and also because of its connections to Hinduism. It's a lot like Vedanta, and I'm an ex-Hindu, and I'm trying to help people escape Hinduism. And I think criticizing Christian Science is a good part or a good place to start because it's a little bit simpler and it's a little bit more obvious to disprove and that kind of thing. So it's, you know, a road towards that. I'm also looking for, I just finished, before this, I finished the segment on Mormonism and Judeo-Freemasonry. I'm looking for Mormons. I'm coming up to Jehovah's Witness. After that, I'm doing Seventh-day Adventist. So if you're ex any of those religions, you can also contact me at vincent.bruno.1229@gmail.com. Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses are at bewisestserpents.blogspot.com. Seventh-day Adventist, you can find a link at the bewisestserpents.blogspot.com website to butharmlessasdoves.blogspot.com, and that's about Seventh-day Adventist. Yeah, so if you're interested in exposing the Judeo-Freemason elements of your religion, then contact me. Okay, so we have been reading the biography of Mary Baker Eddy, Mrs. Eddy by Edwin Dankin, 1929. Very unflattering biography of her. He was obviously not a fan of hers. And then we are also listening to Mary Baker Eddy's book Science and Health, and we're on part 7 of that. So yeah. So okay, let me start. Okay, so we were reading. All right, so her family, she's given over almost all her assets to the Christian Science leaders, and she's very old, and the journalists and her family are in cahoots now to get her determined to be incompetent and unable to take care of her affairs so that her son can come in and take over the will. And they're asking her questions and stuff, and they've been asking her questions, and she seems to have been answering it quite capably. They're trying to determine whether or not she's mentally capable of doing her own affairs. So what I asked Mrs. Eddy is if you are willing to tell us something of the development of your so-called Christian Science. I would love to do it. Tell us as fully as you please. I think we would all like to hear it. She started at once, her soprano voice pitched without inflection, as if reciting an oft-coned piece. I was an invalid born in belief. I was always having doctors. When you say born in belief, interposed the doctor, I perhaps do not understand what you mean. The old lady looked at him severely and with reproof. I mean, born according to human nature, born not of God, but of the flesh. That is what I mean. I was an invalid from my birth. Can you tell us something about the way in which you were an invalid, if you can recollect it? No, uncertainly, I cannot recollect it. I was weak and dyspeptic. I asked you to tell me something about the development of Christian Science. Will you go on if you please? She was a little impatient with him. I would gladly do it, as I said. Go on if you will, he urged. My father employed doctors of the highest character, and they were estimable men. Dr. Renton was one, and he said, and the other said, don't doctor your children. She has got too much brain for her body. Keep her out of doors. Keep her out of doors, keep her in exercise, and keep her away from school. all you can and don't give her much medicine. She paused to explain to a younger and ignorant generation, then it was all allopathy, you know. Can you tell how about how long ago that was, please? No, I should say I was 18 years old, along there, about there, and it came to me. No, I wasn't so old as that, I think. And it came to me through Dr. Merrill that I was a homeopath, that he was a homeopath, and I had never heard of that before. It was a new subject in New Hampshire, and father says, well, I thought he was a fine fellow, but he must have gone mad to have taken up homeopathy. Well, that was the general idea of things. And when he came to Concord, people thought that of him generally, I think, but he healed the cases that the MDs did not. And my father employed him, and I got well under his treatment. But you asked me to tell my footsteps. I did. I studied homeopathy. Her voice trailed off as she moistened her lips and looked at the inquisitors before her a little piteously. May I lean back in my chair? Yes, if you get tired, say so. She settled herself more easily and resumed the role that was so difficult before these grave, solemn men. Then I said, I will study homeopathy. I did. I was delighted with it. I took a case that doctors up there consider hopeless, and I cured the case, and she was like a barrel in the bed full of water, and cured her right up. Now that the floods tide of her recollections were unloosened, she went on garrulously, endlessly, and grandmotherly and pathetic old lady, a grandmotherly and pathetic old lady who had at last found an appreciative audience for the sort of things she liked to talk about: stocks, bonds, investments, unimportant details about making roads, and trusts held no interest for her. It was much more fascinating to dwell on the long and romantic past, the years of struggle, the climb from obscurity, the rebuffs from cruel enemies. And now look at her, Mary Baker Eddy, enthralled in her old age, so that even her smallest recollection was of the great importance of these eminent masters appointed by the Supreme Court. This woman had quite a life. She never took her eyes off her inquisitors, those shining eyes in her withered face. Back and forth her hands fluttered, now touching the diamond ornament at her throat, now pulling at her black shawl, now smothering at her dress or twining in her lap. Her droning voice never wavered. It was with difficulty that the masters brought her to an end, thanked her formally for receiving them, paused to hear her play the graphone, which she displayed with childish delight as her artificial voice ushered themselves out of the penumbrous room. Hardly were they in the hall when they heard the sharp clangor of a bell echo throughout the house. In an instant, Fry came hurrying after them to say that Mrs. Eddy had not finished her statement and wished to complete it. Back to the library, the eminent visitors hurried. Mrs. Eddy sat in the armchair where they had left her, upright and rigid, excitement in her pale face. I felt I did not answer you fully, she told them with a new forcefulness in her voice. I dropped my subject before I concluded. It was regard to the footsteps to Christian Science. Judge Aldrich told her that he had not really wished to push this line of inquiry further, that he not only desired not to weary her, but most important, did not desire to have his questions appear to be an attack on her doctrine. Mrs. Eddy insisted that she would deem it a favor to be allowed to explain these mysteries. When I came to the point that it was mind that did the healing, she said, I wanted to know what mind that was. Was it that mind that was in Jesus Christ, or was it the human mind and human will? Then I went on an investigation of spiritualism, mesmerism, and hypnotism to see if I could find out, and I didn't find good there. Therefore, I turned to God in prayer and said, just guide me to that mind which is in Christ. And I took the Bible and opened it at the words, now go write it in a book. I can show you where it is in the Bible. She spoke almost without pause, just as if she were repeating one of the well-learned talks that she had used for so many years in her classrooms. I then commenced writing my consciousness of what I had seen, and I found that human will was the cause of disease instead of its cure, that hypnotism and mesmerism as human conceits did not heal, they were the origin of disease instead of its cure, that the divine mind was the healer. And then I found it through the scripture. He healed old diseases, go into the field, preach the gospel, heal the sick. And I felt there was my line of labor that God did the healing, and that I would no more heal a person through mortal mind or willpower than I could heal them by cutting off their hands. And I could not hurt them by it, for I don't know how to use willpower to hurt the sick. I don't know how to do it. Her voice broke for a moment, memories crowding in of the old accusations that she had sought with incantations to kill Spofford and Kennedy and Aarons. When they began to talk mesmerism, first I began to doubt it, and I said to a facetious student, Hanover Smith, you go into the other room and see if I can sit down and tell lies enough to make you suffer. He went into the room, and I commenced what they said to make folks sick, and I did my best talking it. And he came in, and I said, Hanover, do you feel mean? He said, I never felt better in my life than I do now. I feel better than when I went in. I feel rested. A Christian Scientist, she went on in her thin treble, can no more make a person sick than they can be a sinner and be a Christian Scientist. They can no more make them suffer or injure them in any way. They have not the power to do it. All the power they have comes from the high. We have no power and no faith in any other power. Now I have finished. I thank you for your kindness and attention very much. The old lady made a motion of dismissal with her hand graciously, imperiously, and leaned back in her chair with contentment on her face, utterly weary with excitement, but satisfied. She had made her defense, had been given an opportunity wholly to confound those old accusations of enemies who had tried to paint her as a sorceress of evil. She rested wanly against her cushions, a lonely old woman eager to understand, and the master went back to ponder the evidence and consider what their decision would be. The question of Mrs. Eddy's legal competency was never allowed to reach adjudication. Before the end of August, Senator Chandler withdrew his suit, and the whole matter was eventually compromised. But no one heard Mrs. Eddy talk to the distinguished masters, could have believed her any less competent to manage her business affairs than any other old lady of her years, or that, in the words of Judge Aldrich, any other possible delusion would operate unfavorably and prejudicially to the contingent rights of relatives. There can be small doubt that to the end of her days, Mrs. Eddy was well able not merely to garner money, but also to keep it after she got it. As one of the alienists employed by her own counsel, Dr. Alan McLean, said in a formal statement, I'm firmly of the opinion that she is competent to take care of herself and that she is not coerced in any way. In fact, it would appear as if she takes the initiative upon all occasions. On the other hand, posterity is not greatly concerned with the small business of how competent Mrs. Eddy directed her business affairs during her declining years. Rather, must its interest be centered on a question of much broader implications, the manner in which her complex mind was related to the ordinary human norms. In the last analysis, posterity can be the only final judge regarding the degree of Mrs. Eddy's sanity, and in its deliberations, many considerations must be involved. It is easy to conclude that a man is sane as long as he accepts the common standards of the community in which he moves, and just as easy to pronounce him insane as soon as he varies widely, either from the motivations or conclusions which impel his neighbors. Yet the outstanding difference between the genius and the madman is often only the fact that the genius eventually makes his own unique logic accepted by his fellow men, while the madman never convinces his neighbors of the reality of the world as he himself views it. Thus, many a genius has been regarded as a lunatic until men came gradually to share in some of his convictions, and conversely, history presents the record of many lunatics who temporarily achieved the status of genius merely because they were able to for a brief time to cast the spell of their delusions over some of their fellows. It must be obvious, at least, that sanity is merely a relative state. A man in the midst of society might be adjusted hopelessly insane, Yet if he is placed alone on a desert island and is able there to fend for himself and carve out his natural environment, the needs of his human existence, he has every right to regard himself as completely rational. He is setting his own norms in a world of his own creation. The only standard by which he may be judged is his ability to continue animal existence in his environment, either by adjusting his needs to the limitations of the environment, or else by adjusting the environment to his needs. This is to an extraordinary degree a parallel of remarkable career of Mrs. Eddy. She created for herself a unique universe in which she herself established all standards. She created it after finding herself in complete conflict with the world in which her fellows moved by norms that were utterly at variance with her own nature. In the new world which she molded, after having battled unsuccessfully with the old one for more than half her life, she did not succeed in eliminating conflict, but she at least designed and built a little enclosure of her own in which she satisfied a fair proportion of her desires, in which she alone made the measures, in which she alone was arbiter. And she lived and moved in this environment of her own design with perhaps as much success as others beings generally demonstrate in adjusting themselves to the other world with the majority of people accept as its natural habitat. Had Mrs. Eddy taken ship from her own isolated island and returned to the world known to the majority of men, she might possibly have been classed as a paranoiac. But Mrs. Eddy never returned. She lived and moved and reigned in isolated state, building herself an empire and eventually attracting from among passers-by visitors who stopped off and remained to be ruled. Thus it was that she not only created her universe but populated it. She herself chose and the inhabitants. None of those who passed her port was allowed to stop off unless he too had a cast of mind that could subscribe to the norms Mrs. Eddy herself accepted. If occasionally there landed someone whose mental processes differed from those of Mrs. Eddy and were more like those of the old world which she had left behind, then he was cast out immediately. For judged by the standard of Mrs. Eddy's world, it was he who was insane. If he could not accept this and subscribe to the conceptions which she had established in her island universe, if he found himself at variance with the majority there, it was he who was irrational and not the rest. Okay. Hold on. Okay, let's listen to Science and Health.
Material, but principle or soul cannot be compressed in one of its ideas into what it is made. If God is in a body, he is person and not principle. Hence, man is not his likeness or reflection. Again, the discord that comes from the belief of soul in body and intelligent matter at once proves this theory of being a belief only, an error. Mortal man is very unnatural image and likeness of God immortality. Turning from the contemplation of soul and matter, we shall not call on drugs, laws of health, etc., for health or happiness, but obtain these by losing sickness, sin, and death. In the science of being, soul meets all wants spiritually, giving not a tone for bread. The flesh lusteth against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. Hence the natural antagonism between spirit and matter. St. Paul called the body of soul a spiritual body, and the flesh a natural body. And what is more probable, someone else translated it thus, when he longed to lay off his body. That is, to destroy this belief, he must have thought it a very unnatural body, as he gained life, that is, God's spirit. The personal man and woman is neither us nor our local habitation. Who is safe leaning on man or the body, or finds sufficient life or love in man to make him happy? We feel this lack and the great need of resting on something higher. There is no lack in God, but we do not avail ourselves of spirit, but of personality or matter. Joint heirs with God are the partakers of an inheritance where there is no division of estate. We are spirit, but knowing this not, we go on to vainly suppose ourselves body and not soul. God is not a personality, and soul is not in body. The immortal is not within the mortal, nor life in death. This belief was hidden, the glorious truth of man's being, and turned him away from his original selfhood. Hence the great need we feel for something better, higher, and holier than personal man. The material man depends for happiness in life on sense instead of soul, on matter rather than spirit. Hence the insufficiency he finds in himself or personal man. But looking away from sense to soul and taking the principle of life to demonstrate man, we regain the understanding of our God being. And instead of vain repetition, such as heathen use, made to far off personal deity to aid this hour, we must put our finger to our lips, remembering that the Spirit knoweth, while personal sense knoweth not, what man hath need of. The Father of the rain, who hath begotten the dew, and bringeth Mazareth into his season, and guides Arcturus with his new sons, knows the wants of every one of its ideas, and controls man and the universe in harmony and immortality. If only we realize this glorious truth, it would silence sense, and leave the body in the hands of soul, where all would be well with it. Man has no intelligence wherewith to govern man, however much he may say, I have made a covenant with my eyes, etc. Personal views of the supreme intelligence are so bigoted or narrow and inverted, they neither reach principles nor represent it, but appeal to a personal God of whom we have beard through the hearing of the ear. Eye hath not seen spirit, nor hath ear heard its voice. Reverse this order of things, and above the appeal to a man-God, lift thyself to the wisdom and love that maketh the God-man, and you will at length reach Christianity. Denying sense and holding no intelligence in matter, we have the guidance of spirit leading in the way everlasting, where the belief of supreme being changes from person to person. Job said, after the withdrawal all his matter treasures, I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye seeth thee. Personal man is only an atom in immensity. Therefore, the impersonal life and love that embraces all things cannot be found in him. We must look outside of man for life and love, for it is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. Reckoning ourselves from the standpoint of soul instead of personal sense, we progress as spontaneously as light emits light. But reversing this order of science in which man begins in the body, and looks there for both pain and pleasure, yea, for life and for death, he retrogrades hourly until he finally disappears in what is termed death. The evidence of personal sense, or life and matter, is utterly reversed in science, wherein we learn that there is neither a personal God nor personal man. But here do you say, you have taken away my Lord, and I know not where you have laid him. I have lost my Maker and my own identity. Look away from your body, and you will find them. Let go the belief you live in matter, and you will grow as the bird that bursts from the ovum. Personality will be swallowed up in the boundless love that shadows forth man, and beauty, immortality, and blessedness be the glorious proof of existence you recognize. This is not losing man nor robbing God, but finding yourself more blessed, as principle and person, as God than man, as soul and sense, and yourself and the neighbor one. This science of being lessens not the dependence of man on God, but heightens it. Neither does it diminish the high obligation of man towards God, but greatly increases them. It deteriorates not in the least from every possible perfection in God, because ascribing all to the impersonal life, love and truth. Personal love is little better than personal hate. Both bringeth a snare, for their foundations are error, vis-a-vis intelligence in matter, and we cling to them, only because we have not reached higher, not that God is found in them, but that we are groping darkly for him where he is not, when there is no place where his voice is not to be heard. Is there one individual putting off the old man and putting on the new, who has not felt the loss of personal pleasure and pains? Yes, and of personal friends, before he found what belongs not to person, namely the enlargement of his being in love and wisdom that reaches beyond personal pain or pleasure. The loss of a friend has, perhaps, given you the explanation of this. Pain quickly informs us that personal pleasure is mortal, and that both are error. A sinner believes momentarily he is happier for wrongdoing, and another man that he suffers for doing right. The one is a belief of personal pleasure, and the other of pain, but both are false. God is not the author of personal sense or discord. Would existence seem blank without a personal friend? Then the time cometh when you will feel this solitude, and when this vacuum must be filled with principle instead of person, and with the love that is God. When this hour for development arrives, you will suffer from personal enemies so severely it will cause you to approach more readily the science that destroys all personal trust and gives you higher joys, even as pain is salutary in taking away a belief of pleasure and sense. These are the footsteps of science, by which truth amputates error. Our individuality is never lost, but the belief of life, intelligence, and substance in person is lost. Universal love is individual also, embracing every idea from infinitesimal to infinity, and so of joy that issues from spirit. It is both individual and collective. You cannot be alone, for God and man are inseparable and eternal, and the rich blessings of understanding your individuality in spirit and not matter, as soul and not sense, is that you may learn how to follow Jesus in the saying, I and the Father are one. This spiritual understanding of man tends not in the least to humanize Jehovah, but to turn man from the human to the divine, from the belief of life and matter to the life that is truth, to raise the understanding above frailty, and to pass the barriers of sense into the impersonal evermore of being. That man epitomizes the universe and is the body of God is apparent to me not only from the logic of truth, but in the phenomena that is sometimes before my spiritual senses, and which the late celebrated naturalist, Agassiz, saw in his microscopic examination of the vulture's egg. We had made the discovery through spiritual sense that the body of soul embraces the universe, and that man is the full idea of life, substance, and intelligence, before seeing this corroborative evidence of Professor Agassiz's discovery, in which he saw the atmosphere, sun, moon, stars represented in the ovum of a bird, the point where the so-called embryonic life is formed appearing as a sun. Intelligence outside of matter embraces every idea of man in the universe. This intelligence is soul, and man borrows all life and intelligence from this, his principle, even as the earth borrows light and heat from the sun. Water corresponds in figurative purity to love, out of which wisdom produced the dry land, that is the condensed idea of creation. And God divided the light from the darkness. Truth and error were distinct in the beginning and never mingled. The idea which reflects most life and intelligence is man, and corresponds to the meridian light, that of lesser effulgence to dawn and twilight, which are named the morning and evening of their day. All calculations of a solar day were not out of the question in the record of the first Genesis. The sun was not then created, and wisdom measured not time by matter. Therefore, morning and evening were figurative of the ideas of God, faintly appearing and then disappearing in belief, but soon to be symbolized by greater light, corresponding to the solar sun, or the meridian idea representing the principle of man, and man this idea. And God said, Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters to divide them. The firmament was the understanding that divided the waters into those above and those below, into the spiritual and material, that we learn are separated forever. Identity was given the idea, representing immortal man. The material or mortal man was belief. Firmament or understanding, united principle to its idea. Life and intelligence, this principal idea, the universe and man. And God made the firmament. This shows that life, truth, and love produced the understanding and separated it from belief, and all was good that God made. Also, that understanding interpreted God, and was the dividing line between truth and error, to separate the waters which were under the firmament from those above it, to hold life and intelligence that made all things distinct from what it made and superior to them, controlling and preserving them, not through laws of matter, but the law of spirit. In this arrangement all was good, it being the order of science, and God called the firmament heaven, that is harmony, even the result of understanding. The first day in spirit is when he whom to know aright is life eternal, that is, life, love, and truth bring forth their idea. The second day is to perceive, and the third to understand this idea, vis-a-vis heaven, earth, and man. And God said, Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding feed, etc. Let the idea of creative wisdom reflect its principle of creation, showing that the seed yields not an herb because of a propagating principle in itself, for there is none, inasmuch as intelligence made all that was made. The idea was only to shadow forth what intelligence had made. Science not only reveals this, but the Scripture repeats it, that God made every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. Mathematically speaking, 10 multiplied by 10 produces 100, but the science of being assures us intelligence produces the units and multiplies them. Hereway, we learn creation of wisdom and are not dependent on laws of matter, but on intelligence alone. It was spirit that moved upon the face of the deep and brought out of chaos order, a universe, and man as the infinite idea of God, unfathomable mind, had expressed itself. The earth brought forth grass and yielded fruit, in obedience to intelligence and not matter, even as a picture is produced by the artist. The idea of creative wisdom and love was given its identity, but it was mind, first and last. The grass and tree grew from out of the infinite thought that embraced and expressed them. The artist transfers a landscape from soul to sense, but his only immortality is in the intelligence that forms it. The most important idea of creation constituted the third day, and was the third epoch, a number corresponding to the resurrection. The third and seventh periods reveal the advanced idea, whereby intelligence is seen the life of the grass, the herb, the tree, etc., and every manifestation of life understood not substance, but the idea of the creative life and intelligence, in no way contingent on organization or matter. This is manifestly the science of being brought to light in our Master's reappearing on the third day, when the idea named man appeared to his students, independent of matter conditions, and also the finished figure of creation on the seventh day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens, to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and years." Hereby we learn the continuation of vegetation, and the years of age of man are not contingent on seasons, measured by our solar years, or governed in the least by the so-called laws of matter, for the light of understanding was to govern every idea of intelligence. There was but one lawgiver. When the stars first sang together, and harmony was the anthem of creation. And God made two lights, the greater to rule the day, and the lesser the night. He made the stars also. The sun is figurative of the soul and the principle of man and the universe, of the life and intelligence outside of matter that governs the entire creation. Stars represent scintillations of truth that appear in the twilight of understanding or darkness of belief. Matter never represented God. Geology cannot explain the earth nor one of its formations, for these formations are dependent alone on spirit that gave them forth the eternal heavens, earth, and man. Intelligence formed and peopled the universe. The scripture gives no record of solar light until after time had been divided into day and night, and vegetation was formed, showing you light was the symbol of the life-giving creator and not a source of light to the vegetable kingdom. All are but parts of one stupendous whole, whose body nature is, and God the soul. Spirit is inseparable from its idea, but never in it. One cannot exist without the other. Principle would be non-entity without its idea, and idea could not be without its entity or principle. Soul exists not without man in the universe, for it is never separated from the complex and reflex shadow of itself, but God, the soul of all, is not in man or matter. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth the moving creatures that hath life," the ideas of God that represent life outside of matter. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful, multiply," etc. Here the difference is shown between wisdom's approval of those things created by spirit, and the command for them to multiply, and the curse upon Adam's race that sprang from dust matter, so far life, truth, and love had made all that was made, and pronounced it good. But we have no record of that creating sin, sickness, or death. All was good that was created by God. The same truth that made man harmonious will destroy at length the belief of life in matter or mortal man, and reveal man the forever idea of God. But this truth is met with the malignancy of error in return for love, shedding its blessing unsparingly on all. Malice pursues the reformer through every avenue of society, and the evil it persecutes and the pride that refuses aid binds the hands and feet of philanthropy, and then calls for stronger proof of active limbs. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and saw that it was good. The beast and reptile made by love and wisdom were neither carnivorous nor poisonous. Love never created hatred, nor truth error. In the science of being, man preys not on his fellow man, and his neighbor is as himself. One beast shall not devour another, and the lion shall lie down with the lamb, and the little child shall lead them. The wisdom that handled serpents unharmed, and that made a staff as a serpent, held dominion over reptiles and over all the earth. This dominion was illustrated by Moses and the prophets, and afterwards by Jesus and his disciples, the very best examples to elucidate the truth of being. Understanding the science, Daniel was safe amid the hungry lions, well knowing the intelligence that formed the lion was superior to him. Therefore he took refuge from the belief of life in matter ready to perish. In life, that was God, where safety and refuge lay, and this demonstrated his control over the beasts of the field. Understanding life not at the mercy of death, and spirit superior to matter, saved the prophet from the hungry lions. To conclude an animal is superior to man, that matter is power and life in the body, leaves man in the hour of danger, a Samson with eyes plucked out, his strength a spectacle of weakness. When immortality is better understood, there will follow an exercise of capacity unknown to mortals. Man will become 100-fold more a man when he holds himself in the science of being, starting from the basis of spirit. In truth, there is endless strength in immortality. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowls of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth." The us used in this quotation referred to intelligence, the creative wisdom, and expressed plurality. Therefore, if God is a person, it plainly implied more than one God. But to gain the right interpretation, which in the spiritual sense of this saying is to admit the us referred to, life, truth, and love, even the triune principle that reveals the life that is truth and the truth that is life, and both God and God, love. Let them have dominion also signifies plurality, for man was a generic name of mankind. In contradistinction to the belief that God made one man, and man made the rest of his kind, science reveals the fact that he made all. The photographer transfers a likeness of one or more objects according to the number present, and we admit the likeness of three is not one, and vice versa. Therefore, as man is the likeness of God, the plain expression, "Let us make man," and "let them have dominion," is conclusive evidence that God made man the idea of infinite mind, and was the plural, life, love, and truth. Not a plural person, but a principle that gave the infinite idea. There could be no second creation after all was made that was made, nor ever a man formed since the full idea of God was given. So God created man in his own image, male and female created he them. Hereby we learn man was a generic name, also that he reflected the principle of male and female, was the likeness of us, the compound principle that made man. Male and female cannot be one in person, but are one in principle. And if God is a person, his gender would be both male and female, these being the likeness of him, as the scripture informs us. But for these different personalities or sexes to be found in one person would be deemed monstrous. Hence, male and female being the likeness and representation of God, we learn that person is not the image of him, much less can he be in person, inasmuch as he is principle embracing the masculine, feminine, and neuter, represented by the universe in man.
Okay, let's keep reading. Had Mrs. Eddy failed in her task of creating separate universe for herself, had she been unable to maintain herself in this new enclosure, then the world she left behind would have nodded sagely, and its every man might have tapped his finger to his head, since she not only tamed her wilderness, but attracted to her novel empire many others willing to give her fealty. The world can well recognize her unique achievement. She achieved indeed what not many men or women in history have ever attained. For few individuals who have found themselves utterly at variance with all other men have ever succeeded in growing forth and establishing apart from the rest of humanity a world of their own design. It is a mark of genius in a man when he is not content to adjust himself to his environment, but attempts to instead to remold his circumstances more in accordance with his desires. It is this gift of recreation which above all distinguishes a man from lower beasts to the degree to which he may possess it. It cannot be denied that Mrs. Eddy demonstrated the possessions of such a gift in an extraordinary way. She started by seeking flight and escape. She ended by tearing down every obstacle in the world around her and then rebuilding her own realm to suit her desires and needs. She flung bridges where she found chasms. She leveled mountains with magnificent daring where she desired plains, distorted the course of whole rivers when she sought them inconvenient, reared entire cities when she wanted a bit of shelter, raised innumerable temples when she wished to be worshipped, built vast gauls when she had a subject she wished to condemn. The prodigality of her energy, her ambition, and desire to lavish scale on which she operated can only amaze and confound. Yes, she was a very amazing person. Had Mrs. Eddy's own hopes and dreams been fulfilled, she would eventually have had the majority with her. She never ceased to dream that all mankind would someday desert the old world which she herself had found unbearable and enter into her own universe to enjoy the lofty fantasies which she had erected there. She was a sick woman and thought that all the world was sick. She desired escape and thought that all humanity must need to release. So it was that she beckoned to the multitudes. And she indeed lured many to share her refuge, but the millions of whom she gestured never came. It now seems probable that her hope of building for the majority of man and of drawing all humanity within the boundaries of her mystery country will never be fulfilled. Probably the majority will always be on the outside, but posterity should be exceedingly slow to pronounce on Mrs. Eddy the usual verdict of the majority when it judges the being who was refused to accept the validity of the reality known as the mass mind. It can well afford to temper its a judgment with admiration and acclaim for a unique achievement. It can wisely give careful consideration to Mrs. Eddy's empire to see if men may not discover there some law of building which can be more widely applied in the world which the majority calls real. If a single principle can be found there which is useful to the world in general, then humanity need not quarrel with her memory. It will not matter then she may not have been the first to employ this principle. Her contribution will be no less if she merely demonstrated it, helped to test it, managed to bring it to the attention of others who might never otherwise have known that it existed. Her empire may even fall into rack and ruin, yet if from its towers one contribution to human knowledge can be salvaged, then Mrs. Eddy's strange universe was an advance in the evolution of the worlds. As so often happens with those who achieve momentously, Miss Eddy's lived too long. Had she died even 10 years before the expiration of her allotted span, she would have blazed out in a consummate human glory. The illness of the old age, the weakness to which all flesh is heir, despite their ever renewed eagerness of its denials, was her undoing. Her pride was tarnished by her own misery. Vandals broke into her isolated universe from the other world she had thought to be escaped from forever, and before they had been repelled, she had been struck to the heart as she sat gasping on her throne. The case which sought to demonstrate her mental incompetence was withdrawn for probably just one reason. Senator Chandler must have feared that the decision might go against him due to the court ruling which restricted the evidence that he might offer. The action had again one end so far as the interests of Mrs. Eddy's possible heirs were concerned, in that she had appointed trustees who would conserve the resources of the estate. Meanwhile, it seemed wiser for Senator Chandler to avoid any decision adverse to his clients, withdraw his case while he could, and prepare to attack from a new angle. It seemed to him probable that he could have better hope of success by starting an entire new action to test not merely Mrs. Eddy's competence to make a deed of trust, but rather her entire mental status over a long period of years. The menace of a suit of this nature was regarded by the officials of Mrs. Eddy's church with extravagant horror. Whether Mrs. Eddy were eventually adjudged to be legally sane or insane, a normal person or a paranoiac, the whole action might be dragged through the courts for the endless months, and the resultant publicity would have possibilities of damaging her church to an irremediable degree. Accordingly, General Streeter attorney for Mrs. Eddy opened negotiations for a compromise offers to create a generous trust fund out of Mrs. Eddy's estate for all the plaintiffs were extended. In view of his duty to his clients, it seemed wise to Senator Chandler to accept such an offer. Mrs. Eddy, as she thought over the whole situation, was by moods indignant, tearful, and horror-stricken. She blamed the whole situation on malicious animal magnetism. Her physical health, instead of declining after 1906, had for a while showed encouraging improvement, but mentally she was extremely distraught. While the next friend's case was still hanging in the courts, it was arranged that Arthur Brisbane, who had some close Christian Science friends, should interview her and write a friendly article that might be useful for general publicity purposes. He asked her the reason for the suit. Greed of gold, young man, exclaimed Mrs. Eddy. They are not interested in me, I am sorry to say, but in my money and in the desire to control that. They never tried to help me when I was working years ago, and when help would have been so welcome. Mrs. Eddy never ceased to speak of her son as if it were her who had deserted her in time of need, just as in stressing his illiterate uncouthness and the manner in which it reflected on her own standing. She never once seemed to realize that she herself might be responsible for George's lacks, but she seemed genuinely affected when young Brisbane, then at the beginning of his fame as a newspaperman, asked her why George had joined the action. Tears filled her eyes, her voice broke, and she could not go on. Finally, she turned to General Streeter, who was present at the interview, to make sure his clients had wise guidance in what she said. She blinked her eyes a little rapidly and tried to smile. You know what they say, General, she said brokenly. A mother is a mother all her life. A father is a father till he gets a new wife. Before Brisbane left, Mrs. Eddy had recovered her poise and also some of her feeling of indignation. Young man, she remarked with a sonorous gruffness that recalled her compelling voice of earlier years. I made my money with my pen just as you do. I have a right to do it. Immediately after, Mrs. Eddy was told that Senator Chandler was willing to withdraw his suit and would accept an offer from Mrs. Eddy's attorney for a compromise that would protect the financial interests of his clients. She had a great overflowing of the heart. She suddenly felt that God was in his heaven after all, and that it was a time for general rejoice. She decided to have a great jubilee. She instructed General Streeter to have all the papers ready to be assigned a week before Christmas Day. Then on Christmas, she would stage a general homecoming and invite all her exiled family to gather around her. The Glovers, Hithrow to ignore Baker, and even Foster Eddy. Foster Eddy indeed received a letter from her that completely overwhelmed him with its warm friendliness. He had dropped a line to Mrs. Sargent expressing concerns for Mrs. Eddy's health. The reply was written in Mrs. Eddy's own hand. It said under the date of August 30th, 1907, that she had seen his kind letter to Mrs. Sargent, and continued, if you would like to call upon me now, I have a little leisure and would be pleased to see your dear face once more for a chat with you after the old way. She added, make an appointment to see him if he would drop her a line. Apparently no appointment was ever made for Benny to call again upon his adopted mother, for meanwhile all preparations went forward for creating the trust funds and signing the papers in time for Christmas homecomings, which Mrs. Eddy had invited even her attorney to attend. Christmas homecomings, which Mrs. Eddy had invited even her attorney to attend. On Monday, a week before Christmas, all the attorneys were assembled in Boston with their clients sitting within brief call. Glover, who had returned west, was at home, picked and waiting for the telegram saying that his inheritance was ready for collection. Foster Eddy had already arrived in Boston in time to select a new motor car, which he meant to purchase in celebration of getting his share of the Eddy millions. As the attorney and their assistants all sat talking generally around a table, waiting for the arrival of Henry M. Baker, who was to bring the signed papers from Pleasant View. Mr. Baker burst in almost breathless. "Gentlemen," he said dramatically as he stood in the center of the floor without removing his coat, "I have just come from Pleasant View. It is my duty to inform you that Mrs. Eddy refuses to go on with this reconciliation. She says that she will not sign, that she will never admit Glover and Dr. Eddy to Pleasant View, and that she never wants to see either of them again." The meeting broke up in a general dismay and consternation. No one present doubted that the sudden change of mind had come from Mrs. Eddy herself, and that her attorneys were in no way responsible. What had eventually happened to Mrs. Eddy was merely a sudden burst of fear that her advisors were subject to malicious animal magnetism. Once again, she had characteristically reversed herself. Chandler announced immediately that he would enter a new suit and bring the whole matter into the federal courts. Mrs. Eddy told her horrified church officials that Chandler would do what he pleased. She had thought of a more pleasant use for her money than turning it over to mere relatives by natural selection and adoption. The nature of this more pleasant use was revealed in a letter she wrote to Archibald McLellan, her editor, on December 14th, and which was first revealed to the first was revealed to the world when it was published in the Sentinel in December 21st. The Sentinel was a weekly publication which had been organized to supplement the monthly effort of the journal. Mrs. Eddy's letter here said, Mr. Archibald McLellan, "My dear trustee, I desire to commence immediately to found a Christian Science institution for the special benefit of the poor and the general good of all mankind. The founding and endowment of this institution will cost at least $1 million. Please come to me at your earliest opportunity, and I will give you further detail." Okay. Okay, let's listen.
Gender is embraced in spirit, else God could never have shouted forth from out himself the idea of male and female. This idea comes from soul and not body, from principle and not person, which again furnishes the proof that an egg is not the origin of man. The seed never produced a plant, etc. Intelligence made all it was made, and every plant, before it was in the ground, every mineral, vegetable, and animal, were ideas of the eternal thought. Supreme and universal mind embraced every form of the universe and gave it forth as spirit and not matter, and nothing was left for man or for matter to create, after spirit had created all. This is science, and it underlies the harmony of God and man. The scriptures declare God is love, that God is spirit, life, and truth. Now these are not person. Also, there are many persons and but one God. Hence, deity is not person but principle. Judging from Paul's rule to learn the invisible by the things he hath made, the ideas that express God render it impossible for that to be one person, which produces feminine, masculine, and neuter. The expression of God's gender is principle and not person. The entire universe and man represent God as principle and not person, the infinite us that embraced every idea of the universe, shadowing forth each from out itself. The unavoidable result of intelligence that said, "Let there be light," that is, let the infinite be expressed. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by him, and without him there was nothing made that was made. In him was life, etc. And then to conclude in the face of this infinite logic that an egg is the starting point of life, that seed produces germination, etc., is to forget this is mythical, and a belief that usurped the prerogative of understanding. Starting an atom from dust, calling itself life and matter, and resulting in mortality, the very opposite of truth. After all was made that was made, nothing could be added to the infinite expression of infinite intelligence. And person is not the image and likeness of intelligence, or matter or spirit. Therefore, these do not represent the plural us in one principle, nor the generic man or male and female created by principle. We have not as much authority in science for calling God masculine as feminine, the latter being the last, therefore the highest idea given of him. The belief that the form of man is the body of the Supreme Being, or that he is in a body, is the error of the supposed life and intelligence in matter. that bore the fruit of sickness, sin, and death. Even the tree of knowledge, reversing the science of being by supposing soul in body, spirit in matter, and substituting personal sense for soul, having dominion over man instead of man's dominion over matter. This belief embraces all that is finite, sinful, and mortal, but recollected as Adam, the air that sprang from dust, nothingness, and by edict of wisdom will return to it. Man originated in God. He is the product of soul, spirit. Hence, he is idea, not substance. Even the body of soul, his intelligence is spirit, not brains, mind not in matter, God not in person. Love is spiritual, joy-giving, and eternal, a forever assurance that God is love. Personal attractions that originate in the body are fraught with change and death, impure, transient, and mortal. The curse, causelessness, came not to Adam, the original sin, or error. In other words, to this belief of life and intelligence in matter. Spirit originated in matter and intelligence inserted afterwards. Soul pushed into a body, matter intelligent, and the body named man, where personal sense takes the lead of soul, is a myth. God was and is, and man was and is, his reflex shadow. In Genesis, the spiritual record of the universe and man is lost sight of. It was so materialized by uninspired writers. The creations of spirit are spiritual, for they cannot be material. They are ideas of principle thrown off from soul instead of sense, and their substance is their principle. The bride of spirit is the idea of love, the Lamb revealed to John in spiritual vision, not a mere belief of personal attachment. This idea came down from the New Jerusalem, the exaltation of spirit over matter. It was the unselfish, pure, and immortal. We worship we know not what, when we worship in temples made with hands, even our bodies, and from the standpoint of matter instead of spirit. God is love, and man the idea, image, and likeness of him. Love's ideas are spiritual. Its male and female are ideas of soul instead of sense, expressed by the flower as well as man and woman, even those that God hath joined together, and mortal belief cannot put asunder. And God blessed them, and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over every living thing that moveth on the earth. All blessings and powers came with the creation of spirit, and as such they were to multiply and replenish the earth on this basis of being, and subdue it, making matter subservient to spirit, and all would be harmonious and immortal, in contradistinction to the generations of Adam, or the belief that matter subdues spirit. In this science of being, man held dominion over the earth, and every living thing that moveth on the earth. He knew neither life nor power outside the spirit, the governing principle of the universe and man. And this truth of all being, namely that intelligence is the only life and principle of all, brings to light the harmony and immortality of man. Air claims life and matter, hence the creator of propagating vitality in vegetable and animal, and this air was the original sin, it being a belief of God in matter, or matter without God. This was the Adam, so totally depraved, inasmuch as it claimed life, intelligence, and truth. That alone was God. Thinking to put intelligence and life in matter reversed the order of science, giving matter dominion over man. Intelligence multiplies the ideas of God only by destroying the belief of in every formation that is real or immortal. There is no material law that creates and governs man, or that man should obey. Obedience to spiritual law is all that God requires. And this law abrogates matter and makes the body idea, and as such harmonious and immortal. And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of the tree yielding seed. The good fruit was not substance, but the idea of God. To you it shall be for meat. To understand that life is spirit is this idea, and it consists not in the things man eat. It is the truth of man that makes man immortal. But the poor belief that life is supported by bread or meat makes matter his master, and man mortals, however much he may eat. Truth is the immortality of man, and error the unimmortality. Immortality is soul, and not sense. Matter can neither give nor take away life. The scripture saith, Man liveth by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. And this is not material bread, but that which comes from heaven, harmony, giving its idea immortality. We know the belief of life and matter is sustained by eating, drinking, etc., but it reverses the order of creation and predicates life on matter instead of spirit. And every herb bearing seed and every tree in which is the fruit of a tree was given man. The idea of God, and this was man, was superior to earth, because it was the supreme idea that embraced the entire universe in itself, and to which all others were subordinate. In this science of being, the herb bore seed and the tree fruit, not because of root, seed, or blossom, but because their principles sustain these ideas, not as substance, but idea, for intelligence held dominion over matter. Reproduction is the result not of seed or soil, but the principle of man and the universe that produces through intelligence. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, etc., wherein is life, was given every green herb for meat. Unto every belief of life and matter, the green herb symbolizing the immature and imperfect was proportioned, for this belief was air, and must draw its nutriment from the tree of knowledge, whereof if a man eat he should die. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Mark the distinction between the things produced by spirit and those supposed to be material products. Adam was sinful and mortal. In other words, he was air, and this air, the belief that life and intelligence are in matter. The first product of this belief was Cain, a murderer, and earth brought forth thorns and thistles according to air. Adam, and man must live by bread and earn it by the sweat of his brow. The belief of life and matter entailed nothing but discord. Therefore, this belief was error, and error illusion. Science says man has neither birth, growth, decay, nor death. Man is idea and not substance, and spiritual instead of material. God saw all that he had made, inasmuch as intelligence understands all, hence the harmony and immortality of its ideas, and of man as idea, not substance, and governed by mind instead of matter. Mind that comprehends and sustains man, not as matter, but idea. Soul understands this science of being, but sense does not. And the less sense and the more soul is brought out will man appear the glorious idea of immortality. Soul alone comprehends immortality. Personal sense says, when the eye loses sight of him forever, man is dead. Thus the heavens and earth were finished, and all the host of them. Here the scripture repeats again the science of creation, namely, that all was complete and finished. Therefore, that nothing has since been made, that intelligence embraced all from the forever, and that all is perfect, infinite, and eternal. This assurance even is self-sustaining, but to understand it is to gain our harmony and immortality. No geological speculation can change or mar the fact that intelligence, the soul of man, embraces the universe and man in idea, and holds them thus forever. As matter substance, all is lost, but as principle and idea, all is eternal. Never a mineral, vegetable, or animal was formed of dust. Spirit alone fashions all things. Birth, decay, and death are a personal sense of things, not their idea. Man and the universe are complete and eternal in intelligence, and nothing can exist out of that. And on the seventh day, God ended his work, which he had made. This corroborates the statement in science that truth, life, and love had fully wrought out the infinite and eternal idea named the universe and man. Also that error, the opposite of truth, was about to claim a work independent of God, in which matter instead of spirit should be the creator. The truth and science of being were already recorded, but error was now to make a reverse statement of man and the universe, vis-a-vis that life, intelligence, and substance belong to matter, that soul is in body, God a person, man a second intelligence, and evil a third. This error was belief, and belief not mind, but a supposition of mind, not soul, but what is termed personal sense, not spirit, but intelligent matter, all of which is a myth. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and heavens. In other words, when spirit was the creator, generations signified the manifold ideas of intelligence and life. And God made every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. Here again is the undeniable statement that intelligence is the only creator, also that it produces vegetation, not through processes of culture or in obedience to what are termed laws of nature, but in obedience to spirit. God made the plant before it grew. No partnership with matter is here acknowledged, and man was the idea of spirit, and this idea tilled not the ground for bread. The life of idea was its principle. Hence man could not die of starvation or dyspepsia. The time cometh when we must all learn this science of being in order to gain its harmony and immortality, even as we have already learned that the opposite belief of life and intelligence and matter produces mortality, its being a belief of sin, sickness, and death. The record of creation in Genesis repeats 3 times, in the clay that the Lord God made them, indicating there was a time coming when another creation should declare itself the author of man. That creation was the history of Adam and his progeny, or mythological life and matter. After God created man, there was not a man to till the ground, because there was no necessity of it. The earth brought forth spontaneously, and man lived not because of matter, and earth was blessed for his sake. So unlike the curse that came with Adam, or air, spirit was the producer of harmony only, and life self-sustained. Therefore, man was not to live because he ate much or little, giving no opportunity for gluttony or poverty to mar the work of wisdom. Man needed not to cultivate the soil, that matter might produce itself, nor to presume himself on the prerogative of creator. Spirit was the life and creator of all, and its work was complete, and beyond the power of matter to destroy. All things were made when comprehended by intelligence. Soul had all its own possession, and there was no personal sense to do the work of wisdom. Life was not in matter, and there was no existence except to spirit. Nothing is new to intelligence. The infinite understanding is not creating the universe or man anew. These ideas were forever, without beginning, without end. Matter was neither capacity, right, nor power to create or to destroy. All is in the hands of spirit, that hitherto hath wrought independently before belief claimed, through material law, to create and govern mineral, vegetable, and animal. Intelligence made all that was made, and was not in the things it had made. Spirit never passed into matter to produce a world, heaven, earth, and seas, and all things therein came from the eternal thought, and mind no more produces matter than matter produces mind. This is science, that God governs the universe and man, that matter propagates itself through seed and germination its era, a belief only, and not the truth of being. And belief has its penalty, for admitting mineral, vegetable, and animal things of sense instead of soul, and dependent on matter for their ephemeral existence, makes them mortal. Not so with the universe and man, born of spirit, they are harmonious and eternal. But there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Truth created through the understanding, saying, "Let there be light." But error came through darkness or belief, the figurative mist on earth, that which started from a matter basis. Adam was the belief of life in matter that rose from the dust, saying man depends on material structure, and vegetation on the rain and dew. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. This statement of the second creation contradicts the first one, in which Spirit said, "Let us make man." The first record was science, the second was metaphorical and mythical, even the supposed utterance of matter. The scripture, not being understood by its translator, was misinterpreted. After God had declared all was made and the creation good, wisdom never repented or repeated what it had done. There was no second creation and on a new plan. Had the record divided the first statement of creation from the fabulous second by saying, after truth's creation, we will name the opposite belief of error regarding the origin of the universe and man, it would have separated the tar from wheat, and we should have reached sooner the spiritual significance of the Bible. We are repeatedly assured in the second chapter of Genesis that God had finished his work before Adam was created, that male and female, together with all the hosts of heaven and earth, were already made. Therefore, we have the authority of Scripture for denying a second creation or a single formation by matter. The harmonious creation was ended, and all was good that God created. Life, truth, and love never made inharmonious man. God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Admitting he had created Adam, Cain, and every other mortal error, he was the author of evil as well as good. But this is contradicted by the prophet Jeremiah, who saith, out of the mouth of the Most High proceedeth not evil and good. And what did the evangelist mean when he said, all things were made by him, and without him there was nothing made that was made? In him was life, etc. Simply this, that life never created death, nor truth error. It is error alone that produces error. The belief of life in matter, named Adam, brought sickness, sin, and death into the world, and God denounced this error or Adam and said it was mortal. For dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. This was not spoken of soul, nor of man created by God. Life, which is God, never entered into sin and death. Spirit was not the component part of Adam or mortal man. The history of Adam is allegorical throughout, a description of error and its results, opposed to the truth of being and contradicting the divine economy. It makes intelligence, life and substance, matter instead of spirit, saying, believe in me, and I will make ye as gods. More than one God was its starting point. Truth gives the immortal idea or man from spirit, but error, the mortal belief from matter. The express image and likeness of God was immortal man, and there is none other, or ever a man since created. Through a belief of pain and sorrow, error claimed to create man, but truth gave its idea of God in joy, blessing, and dominion. Error's process of creating bases intelligence on matter, or would put intelligence in matter, either of which is impossible, inasmuch as it would make intelligence both God and devil.
Okay, let's finish the reading, and then I'm going to cut it a little bit short today. I don't know. Okay. Probably this bright idea had been born in Mrs. Eddy's mind as a result of the result of the searching investigation of numerous reporters to discover traces of the extensive charities which Mrs. Eddy hinted ever and anon that she had extended to a needy universe. The reporters were forced to announce to the reading public that no traces of such charitable appropriations from Mrs. Eddy's coffers were ever found. Her major donation was a matter of some $10,000 to the city of Concord to be devoted to building and improving nearby roads that she used constantly in her drives. Even this fund consisted partly of contributions from the faithful, and it hardly recompensed Concord for a very human conservatism shown by Mrs. Eddy in her tax payments. It was revealed during the next Friends suit that Mrs. Eddy, although she was able, she must have had over $500,000 worth of taxable property at the time, signed in 1901 a statement that the local tax assessors that she was worth only about $19,000 for tax purposes. The same amount was borne to by Calvin Fry in successive years, time after time, until it was eventually raised to $55,000, where the valuation stood at at the time of the suit. So she had a lot more money, and they were taxing her for him. Mrs. Eddy's idea for $1 million foundation was therefore an answer to the innuendo she's resented so warmly. $1 million comprised approximately the total of her personal cash asset at this period, as opposed to those of her church, which had cash resources of some 12 million. But Mrs. Eddy's project for a great foundation was never realized, for eventually her advertisers prevailed upon her to compromise the next Friends suit. By the end of 1908, Mrs. Eddy was again involved in turmoil. She was busily engaged in finding ways and means to excommunicate Mrs. Stetson. The resulting sensational publicity made it near necessary for the Christian Science Church to take in every sail that could possibly be reefed on a sea that had suddenly become so stormy that catastrophe was threatening on every hand. In consequence, Senator Chandler was asked once more to sit at a round table, and eventually on November 10th, 1909, an agreement was signed by which George W. Glover received a total amount of $250,000 and E.J. Foster Eddy acquired title to $50,000. Glover's patrimony was inclusive of the original trust fund of $125,000, which had been previously set aside for him and which had at that time he had refused. This trust was now increased to $150,000, and he received an additional $100,000 in cash. The agreement with Glover stipulated that he should return all letters which Mrs. Eddy had ever written him. Undoubtedly, it was the scandalous attitude of the newspaper toward Mrs. Eddy and her church during the litigation and the other untoward events of 1906 and 1907 that brought to her the idea of publishing a newspaper of her own, a paper that would carry to her disciples news of the day without thrusting under their eyes in banner headlines the story of Mrs. Eddy's sensational struggles with generally recognized realities. Thus, in one of her reflective moods, she decided on the following letter, which on August 8th, 1908, she addressed to the Christian Science Board of Trustees. Beloved students, it is my request that you start a daily newspaper at once and call it the Christian Science Monitor. Let there be no delay. The cause demands that it be issued. You may consult with the board of directors. I have notified them of my intention. When on September 19th, appeals went out for the funds to enlarge the Christian Science Publishing House, no reason was given for this need, but money started pouring in immediately. As usual, Mrs. Eddy meant to let her disciples do the contributing, and Mrs. Eddy's church would do the owning. It was not her idea, for instance, to sell stock for her new enterprise and thus raise the necessary capital for its flotation. Such a procedure would have made the stockholder part owners. Until she threatened her last breath, Mrs. Eddy was a good businesswoman. When a notice was published in the Sentinel asking scientists who were journalists to volunteer their services for the newspaper, so many responses were received that only a fraction could be accepted. The first issue of the paper appeared the day before Thanksgiving, November 25th, 1908. From the beginning of the Monitor was successful. Its announcing policy being the publication of news devoid either of sensationalism or descriptions of human weaknesses. In explaining the founding of the Monitor, the Sentinel quoted a previous statement from the Mrs. Eddy's printed in her miscellaneous writings under the heading of a timely issue. Having suffered all her life from a fear so insensate that it was pathological, Mrs. Eddy had blandly written, hold on one second. Looking over the newspapers of the day, one naturally reflects that it is dangerous to live so loaded with disease seems the very air. These descriptions carry fear to many minds to be depicted in some future time upon the body. A periodical of our own will counteract to such extent this public nuisance, for through our paper, at the price of which we shall issue it, we shall be able to reach many homes with healing, purifying thoughts. With the Monitor, Mrs. Eddy's church became possessed of 5 periodicals carrying her ideas to the ends of the earth. First came the famous old journal, a monthly. There followed the Christian Science Quarterly, first copyrighted in 1901. The Christian Science Weekly, founded in 1898, had later become the Sentinel. The Christian Science Herald, first copyrighted in 1903, was in 1905 dropped in its English form and given a German setting under the name Der Herald der Christian Science. This circulated widely abroad. None of these publications, however, could occupy the field the Monitor was destined to fill. With the appearance of this daily, it became henceforth unnecessary for any one of Mrs. Eddy's followers ever to obtain news regarding the world's activities and ideas from any other source than Mrs. Eddy's own organization. In the same year that the Monitor was founded, Mrs. Eddy startled the world by moving herself and her household out of Pleasant View. Mrs. Leonard, one of Mrs. Eddy's attendants, her close confidant in her declining years. The woman who had taken her place on the carriage drives while Mrs. Eddy was ravaged by illness died on January 7th, 1908. She was nearly 69 years old. Her death was caused by diabetes, according to a doctor who was called in at the end. During the previous summer, Mary Tomlinson, the sister of the former first reader of the Concord Church and another attendant in the Eddy household, had committed suicide by hurling herself out of a window of the Parker House Hotel in Boston. Mrs. Leonard's death on top of the suicide convinced Mrs. Eddy that malicious animal magnetism was becoming so fatal and so horrible at Pleasant View that she must flee immediately. She felt that malicious animal magnetism was entirely responsible not merely for her own ill health, but also for the cruel events attending the World Expose in 1906 and the subsequent sanity trial in 1907. The fact that even the people around her were succumbing to the poisonous darts of the fiend made her feel actually for her own life and time. And again, she told her companions around her that she feared, unless they gave her adequate mental protection, that she might be killed at night when she slept and was unaware. Finally, she reached the state of mind from which she had suffered in Boston. She felt that she must get away from Pleasant View anywhere, anyhow. During the last 20 years of her life, she had come to love the rambling old house at Pleasant View so dearly that in her will she had even stipulated that she wanted to be buried there. But overnight, this feeling was changed. Pleasant View had become a house of horrors where slimy and ghostly fears sought to choke her almost hourly. She said that it did not so much matter where she went, but she must go immediately. On second thought, she decided that it did matter a great deal where she went. She must get out of New Hampshire. If the laws of New Hampshire had been different, it might not have been possible for her to have been publicly maltreated in such an outrageous manner. She told her trustees that she must leave New Hampshire at once. If she stayed there, she might lose every cent she had to her name. In the emergency, her trustees found a magnificent house in Chest Hill, Massachusetts, surrounded by 12 acres of woodland. They purchased it for her at a cost of $100,000 and had it altered, furnished, and decorated without Mrs. Eddy's ever seeing it. The most extraordinary haste was made with alterations. A force of several hundred laborers was employed. The men working in shifts then ran through the full 24 hours. Huge arc lights were employed to turn the night into day. Despite such an unusual proceedings amid the quiet retreats of Chestnut Hill, news of Mrs. Eddy's plans to flee Concord did not leak out until the flight was actually made. Mrs. Eddy indeed had every step of this new undertaking guarded with jealous secrecy. As always in the past, she feared that some of the mesmerists might discover her plans and seek to betray the enterprise with their wiles. The house of Chestnut Hill, which is a superb suburb of Boston, had been owned by Robert P. Walker, a Chicago real estate dealer and leader of Christian Science in his own city. It was a great stone mansion with some 34 rooms designed in the best modern architectural tradition and suggesting of nothing less than a baronial chateau. Extensive alterations were made for Mrs. Eddy's residence. Her own room of rooms was laid out in southeast corner of the second floor. She insisted when the house was bought that her personal chambers should exactly match in design and plan the 3 rooms in which she had spent her life for the last 10 years at Pleasant View. This instruction was scrupulously obeyed. Directly in front of her boudoir was installed an electric elevator to carry him to and from the lower floors. The whole mansion was magnificently furnished and decorated. On the upper floors, suites of bathrooms were laid out in such a manner that each had a bath. These were designed for the usual mental practitioners whom Mrs. Eddy now maintained around herself and in an ever-increasing throng. The hallucinations of the mansion were provided with stately staircases of steel. On each landing at the second and third floor, an enormous steel safe was built into the walls for the guard of Mrs. Eddy's documents. These were increasing rapidly in number. They included not only the original manuscripts and the proofs for Mrs. Eddy's voluminous writings, but also documents far more obscure. Beginning about 1890, Mrs. Eddy had royal agents engaged in a task for literally scouring New England to gain possessions of old biographical material which might throw on her career a light of different from that in which she herself envisioned it. This material she then secreted, but strangely enough, never destroyed. She had managed to secure a number of manuscripts from which she had originally taught. She obtained possessions of letters which she had later regretted. She sought affidavits from every soul willing to subscribe to a statement which seemed favorable to her conception of herself or unfavorable to those whom she regarded as enemies. No quest was too laborious to be performed in the task of vindicating Mrs. Mary Glover Eddy. When, for instance, it was rumored that Glover had been buried in Potter's Field, one of Mrs. Eddy's officials went south and searched for days for data which would counteract this gossip. The lodge to which Glover had belonged had long been dissolved. Many of its papers had been burned. It was finally discovered that some of its records had been transferred to another lodge and then stored in an old barn. These were ransacked and pored over until the account of the Masonic funeral provided for the major had been discovered. The removal of Mrs. Eddy's possessions into the new mansion, henceforth to become famous as Chestnut Hill, was effectively entirely at night. No one outside of her trustees, not even in her household, and only 2 or 3 high officials of her church knew that the move was to be made until it was actually consummated. The last baggage was transferred on Saturday night. The next day, January 26, 1908, Mrs. Eddy and her ménager were transferred in a state as magnificent as if she had been an empress or a queen. One locomotive went before her train to make sure the tracks were clear. Another followed in the rear to prevent a collision from behind. Thus were precautions taken to prevent malicious animal magnetism from appearing even in the form of an unruly switch or an unexpected impediment on the track. Mrs. Eddy was gowned for her brief journey through the borders of the outside world in softly gray velvet, a gray velvet hat, and gray furs. Heavily veiled, she stepped into her train with elaborate assistance from the men in her household, Dr. Eliphas M. Moorhill, Concord physician, and one of Mrs. Eddy's many second cousins. The Bakers had relatives all over New England accompanied the party. After she entered the great house at Chestnut Hill, the doors were closed and barred from within, and 6 armed men went on watch that night outside the house. Mrs. Eddy had always been a victim of fear. Now, in her very old age, things she feared had come upon her. Okay, so okay, we're not going to listen to that's enough for today. Oh wait, somebody came in. Can I say hello to my fans, Vincent? Hi, fans. I enjoyed the Adam Green appearance. Thank you. Thank you. I was on Adam Green. It went really well. And we talked about Christian Science. All right, guys. Talk to you later. Bye.